Let's play a game of word association. What comes to mind when I say things like guns, missiles, uniform, war? No doubt faces, names, locations, and stories come immediately to mind. Maybe it's the faces of soldiers in Ukraine. Or perhaps you envision a squadron of IDF soldiers in the Middle East. Maybe you think of a grandparent who put on uniform in a war years past. When I think of war, I think of my grandfather and my great-grandfather. My grandfather served as a mechanic in Papua New Guinea during World War II on the island of Bougainville. I remember him telling us stories of his mates on the island, the planes that he worked on, and the volcano that was just nearby. But there are also stories that I know he could tell, but he didn't ever want to. Even though my grandfather, to my knowledge, didn't see active service in World War II, I know that there are elements of it that still haunted him up until his death a year ago. My great-grandfather served in World War I. He was lucky enough to come home, but many of his mates didn't. My grandmother, his daughter, asked him about his experiences in the war, but he didn't want to share them. Not with her, not with his own wife. Whatever trauma he experienced in the war to end all wars, he didn't want to share that with the world. He didn't even want to share it with the ones he loved. And yet, if you were to visit any major capital city in the Western world today, you'll see war memorials scattered here, there, and everywhere, commemorating the men and the women who gave their lives in the service of their country. I myself have visited the War Memorial here in Canberra, ACT, far more times than I can care to recount. If you're a tourist in Canberra, the War Memorial is something you just have to visit. And when you walk into these places, there is invariably a section that is almost church-like. Here in Canberra, it's the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. When you walk into this particular building, you're greeted with an almost cathedral-like environment. The floor and the walls are solid stone. The only discernible feature in the entire place is the aforementioned tomb, a simple stone tomb commemorating the soldiers that were lost and never identified. But then if you look up, you'll see a cathedral-like ceiling, ornate carved stone, and stained glass windows, not depicting saints, not depicting Jesus, not depicting any biblical scene, but pilots, mechanics, nurses, doctors, soldiers. These are the figures of veneration, and you'll see these figures, in many other war memorials all around the world. So what is it about war that inspires awe, transcendence, perhaps even faith? Let's find out today in Science Radio, episode 217, Do We Worship War? Hello and welcome back to another episode of Science Radio. I'm your host, Jesse, and today I am joined by our fearless editor-in-chief. G'day, Jared. How are you?
Jesse, good to be here, mate.
Over the weekend, we in Australia and New Zealand observed an event that comes around every single year, and that's Remembrance Day. It's a day when all of us collectively take a moment to remember the service people in the military and those supporting our military over the years who have given of themselves and in many cases given their lives in service of our country. And Jared, you wrote an article for us in the November issue of Science magazine, kind of provocatively titled, Do We Worship War? Why this perspective?
When I wrote this article, I was reflecting on a visit to Edinburgh Castle recently, and I had been in Europe, in the UK with my wife. It was her first trip over there, and so we were doing all the things, castles, churches, all the tourist spots that we could get to. And when we were in Edinburgh Castle, there's a section that's designated as a war memorial. It's a building that sort of stands alone within the grounds of the castle. And we didn't know what it was from the outside. We thought, oh, what's that? Very dark. You can't really see in through the windows. It's got really interesting architecture, that Gothic style, sort of not clearly a church, but what is this building? So we went in there and we found out, oh, it's actually the part of the castle that's the war memorial. And there were ushers in there, and they were stopping people taking photos. They were stopping loud talking and that sort of thing. And it was really interesting because we had been in a number of churches, and it was far less stringent in terms of enforcing reverence, enforcing quietness and no photos and be respectful. There were signs everywhere saying, be respectful, be quiet. This is a special place. So it just got me thinking that speaks to the title of the piece, Do We Worship War? This is actually a place of almost worship in Western society when the churches are tourist attractions. You've got crowds and crowds of people going through Westminster Abbey every week. You've got the opportunity to take photos and do different things. We actually attended a concert in Dunblane Cathedral. It was a beautiful cathedral. It was a beautiful concert. It wasn't necessarily a worship concert. It was a mixed bag of music. The bagpipe band and a few different things, and a Welsh choral group, a male Welsh choir. If you know anything about singing, that's a pinnacle of, So that was a fantastic thing. But again, it's kind of like our churches are becoming attractions and entertainment, whereas the real reverence is reserved for these war memorials. And it just got me thinking, what is that about? And that's what triggered the article.
I think up until, let's say, the Reformation and the Enlightenment era, at least in the West, religion has been one of the major elements that have bound a nation together. If we think of national identity, if we think of what we all hold in common, once upon a time that was God and the church. And God and the church were a big part of every person's life. Following the Reformation and particularly the Enlightenment, that seems to no longer be the case, at least in the West. There are certainly countries in the world today where religion is a huge part, and I suppose you could probably say in some senses that Islam has become that for many nations around the world. Christianity, for even nations that are overtly Christian, such as, for instance, the United States, religion is still no longer the unifying thing that it once was. And you actually pull out a stat in your article about Scotland. What's the religious affiliation in Scotland right now?
So I was paying attention to this because I saw this stat before I went over there. 2022, their census suggested that 51.5% of the citizens count themselves as having no religion. And so that means atheist, agnostic, they're not following any organized religion, and it's more than half. And so I guess I was looking, as someone myself who's interested in religion and Christianity in the public space and that sort of thing, I went over there going, okay, so this is a non-Christian country now, very much majority religion. What does that look like? And what does Christianity look like in a space where we have no religion? It is, as you said, a bit of a trend, and I do believe Australia will probably hit that 50% milestone in the next census, if not already. They're still waiting for data to come through, but in the next few years, I believe we'll be at that point. And Scotland, the UK, and what's happening in churches there is a bit ahead of us in terms of Australia's journey with religion. And so we can learn from that, I think, just observing what the trends are in those spaces.
It's interesting when you say 51.5%, because for a lot of people, that probably doesn't sound that shocking. But when you consider that 48.5% of the people who identify as religious in Scotland, that's not Christianity. This is a country where the Church of England, the Church of Scotland, has been a huge part of the national history 48.5% of all religious people in Scotland have to share that between all these different pies, whether that be Sikhism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity, and then all the different denominations in Christianity. And one of the things that I have to remind myself a lot of the time is for the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is a Protestant denomination, our church presence in Scotland is classed as a mission, which, if you don't know what that is, basically it's not big enough to be able to fully sustain itself as a conference. It actually has to be supported by the greater church because of how difficult it is to evangelize in Scotland.
Yeah, I actually looked up the stats for that as well because we attended a church, which was a lovely little Seventh-day Adventist church in Scotland, in the town of Crieff, and I didn't realise the mission office is actually right next to the church. And it's basically a garage, the size of a garage, a one-car sort of garage, and that's the mission office. And there's 745 church members, I think, in Scotland, in the whole country. So, yeah, the presence there is quite small. I guess the other interesting thing to point out is that Scotland was one of the first. Some of the missionaries to Scotland came in sort of 500 AD. It's a very long history with Christianity. In more recent times with John Knox and some of the Scottish history, the reform of the church, it was a really strong place for Christianity. Many of the missionaries that came out from the UK and around the world were Scottish background, Scottish heritage folks. And so to see that change in society across perhaps even the last 50 years, it's quite a significant sort of statistic. And yet, this is the point of the article, that the place that religion once held in terms of even national identity, pulling people together, that place is seeming to be filled, or some people seem to be trying to fill that with this sort of national pride that comes with these military holidays, these military recognitions, some of the war movement.
So why do you think the instinct has been to move toward a militaristic collective identity? Is it just the case that there's so little in our Western culture right now that can bring us together that we have to necessarily return to these very basic forms of unity, or is there something else going on in there? What is it that you think is going on?
I think there's a couple of things going on. One of them is potentially, the cynic in me might say that some politicians, some parties, some movements are hijacking this sort of commemorations to build that national pride. There's an agenda to people together and unify them and make them patriotic. It makes it easier to make big decisions as a country if we're all pulled along by these sort of national narratives. And those narratives can be mythologized, and there's a bit of a danger in that. And I think we can unpack that a little more as we go. I think the other thing is it's a very compelling story. I believe in the gospel that Jesus came to reclaim the world, and that there was a sacrifice that was involved with that, and that the human heart is inspired by, drawn to these heroic stories of people putting themselves on the line for others. In the Marvel universe, we remember, and I think we're far enough past this to not be a spoiler, but Iron Man, he makes the ultimate sacrifice. He pays the price. People were in the cinema with tears in their eyes, just being moved by this comic book sort of story, which riffs off the greatest story ever told. This idea that to sacrifice for someone else is noble. It's good. And so the Anzac movement, the memorialization and commemoration of some of these war memorials, it tugs on our heartstrings as humans. It's something that we resonate with, like these people fought for freedom. They laid down their lives. They contributed everything to the country. It's funny, we don't have some of those same feelings right now about what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Ukraine as Russia invades, and a lot of people are dying, a lot of people are displaced, and some of these narratives aren't being told now, but I wonder in 50 years, depending on what happens, which side of history, these are things that people might seize on and then use. Because I think to us growing up, it was always very clear cut. The Nazis were evil. World War II was evil. We had to stop. And it was a thing and everyone was good. But in war, the reality is that both sides do a lot of damage and probably a lot of people die who are innocent and a lot of damage is done. We dehumanize the enemy and we dehumanize ourselves to be able to be effective in war, to be able to get the aims that the politicians or the leaders or whoever's leading is trying to do. And so there's a lot of darkness and a lot of shadow in the pursuit of war. And it's a terrible tragedy. And yet the human heart is drawn to these stories of hope, these stories of overcoming the sacrifice that someone made to save their mates. Just on the news yesterday, they've posthumously recognized a Vietnam vet. And just in listening to what he did, his section commander went down, his forward scout went down, and he went into enemy fire, took out some guys, brought his guy back injured, and then the other guy had been killed, so he brought his body back, and he just kept going back into enemy fire. And it was interesting, the messaging or the language even that the guy on the interview was giving. He said he went in there and he silenced the enemy. Now, if that's not a euphemism for...
That's such a diplomatic, like a beautiful way to say something, which is
he killed
quite
someone
horrific.
or a
really.
number of people. You know?
Yeah.
And so we're drawn to the story. Okay, he saved his mates, or he recovered the body. He did something heroic that is under horrendous, horrible conditions. So we're very much drawn to that. Wow, what that guy did is amazing. But to do so, he had to silence the enemy. Later in the interview, the guy said he overcame the enemy, or and I was just like, these are very sanitized words
very
for what has
romanticized.
happened in that tragic situation. A life was lost is tragic for both sides in the war. I think those are the main two reasons. Just to recap, we're drawn to stories of sacrifice and heroism, and I think that's part of our nature. But at the same time, I think there are people who are hijacking that agenda and potentially using it to further their aims.
Yeah. There's two things going on here in our discussion, I think. There's the romantic ideal of war, particularly in terms of the inspiring stories and those that hit close to home for us. You could juxtapose the Vietnam vet that you just mentioned with Desmond Doss, right? In a similar way, put his life on the line for his mates, but yet he still chose not to carry a weapon or to take another human's life. So the other story, I guess, is these narratives. What do these war stories tell about us as a people? And I think this is fairly natural, right? I think most successful civilizations throughout history have all had a collective story about what kind of people we are, and that usually is told in terms of who we've overcome, what other peoples we've humiliated, who we've conquered, the loot, the booty that we've taken from the other people. And of course, tied into that actually has also been the god that has, or the gods that have enabled us to succeed as a people, and the gods who, in a likewise sense, have failed in the people that we've conquered. Man, there's a lot that we could dwell on here, but let's talk about those narratives. Let's talk about the stories. You mentioned our former Prime Minister, who talks about how the War Memorial here in Canberra, in Australia, is the soul of the nation. He said at that time in 2018 that the War Memorial is sacred to all of us. It transcends politics. It transcends all of us. So why is it that a politician like Scott Morrison would be so interested in venerating the War Memorial for all Australians?
I think it's an important spot for patriotism, to build up patriotism basically in a country, to remember and to memorialize the sacrifice of others. It calls you to a greater love for country. And I think that's what some of these politicians are tapping into. They want us to respect and to admire and to love the country because there's things that it can do. Now, I want to just go to the extreme of this because I think that's the best way to understand it. I'm not saying Australia's doing this. I'm not saying Scott Morrison was trying to do this, but the conditions that can be set up if we take this to the extreme is what we see in, I don't know if you remember, I think we studied World War I as part of our high school history curriculum, and it was the idea of nationalisation, escalating militarism. And to do that, it was painting the other. Dr. Daniel Renaud is an Anzac historian and an expert that we actually reached out to as part of this story, and he gave us some comments. And one of the things he said is that mythologizing war can be a dangerous tool in the hands of an aggressive nationalism that channels discontent into violence against any other group perceived as the other. So he says that Hitler's done it, Stalin's done it, many modern leaders are currently doing it, particularly in Russia, China, North Korea, but also politicians across Europe, America, and even Australia. Now, he's not suggesting that our politicians in some of our Western countries are doing it to the level that Stalin or Hitler or some of these guys did it. But I guess he's identifying a reason for why would they say that it's the soul of the nation? Why would they encourage people even into these sort of commemorations? And part of it comes down to just having everyone pull in the same direction, I think. Just to make sure we're all on the same page. This is a myth that unites us. It's a thing that makes us feel proud as Australians or has an interest in. I grew up reading a lot of historical fiction and the battles and the world politics that were to get out on top. It's fascinating. It's such an interesting story to me, and I'm sure to many others, the idea of war. And so one of the things I did in my life, which I was really excited to do and wanted to do at some point, was to walk the Kokoda track. Just because of the place that it holds as an Australian. Like, you hear the stories of how we were undermanned, ill-supplied, and yet we fought on that track and we held our own. We got pushed back, but we held the Japanese back and we saved the country. Our soldiers on that track saved Australia from being taken over, overrun during World War II. And it really does get into your psyche as an Australian. These stories are like, wow. It actually was miraculous. It was amazing, the feats that some of these guys did. And in that sense, they should be remembered. I think the other thing too, though, is as religion loses its place in our society, we have to be very careful what we replace it with. And so I think the push from some people is religion has been criticized as a tool. I think someone fairly famous once called it the opiate of the people. Religion has been unfairly sometimes criticized as a tool to control people, to herd the masses and to get them to do what you want them to do. Now, if religion is leaving the public space, people need to replace it with something. And it's possible that this worship of war, this commemoration, can turn into something that's a national story. It's a myth that holds us all together. But to what end? To what agenda? How will that go? We can be thankful that our world isn't quite what it used to look like. We're a little more aware of the horrors of war. We see children being pulled out of rubble with blood streaming on their face, and we don't like that. We don't like to see those things. And so the idea that, we'll just be at a private school and we'll be encouraged to sign up to do our bit for the country. I really got into this war poet. His name was Wilfred Owen, and unfortunately he died in France on November the 4th, 1980, just before the end of the war. Wow. And he quotes in one of his poems, it's called Ed Decorum Est, and he says that old lie, which is where he ends the poem, basically it means sweet and right or noble or good it is to die for one's country. That was a Latin sort of phrase that they would often quote. Sweet and noble it is to die for one's country. And he calls it a lie. His poetry is very in your face about the realities of the horrors of war. And so we're not in that place, I don't think, as a society where we're honoring and what's the word I'm looking for? Making war seem like an amazing adventure. Oh, I'm going to sign up and I'm going to have this amazing adventure. I think we're a little more world-wise than that. We understand that war is a horrific sort of spot to be in. And yet, we as humans have very short memories. And the longer we are as a country not involved in a significant conflict that really is pressuring us, the more this narrative can work behind the scenes to make it seem a little heroic again, to seem a little accessible again.
Let's talk a little bit about the heroes. It's interesting, when you're speaking about this stuff, there are certain films and TV shows that come to mind. Band of Brothers is definitely one of the ones that sticks out to me. We see that very poignant story arc for a lot of the characters, going from civilian life to basic training to World War II. And the other one, I think, which is a poignant example of this, is the recent film, I believe it came out either last year or the year before, All Quiet on the Western Front, which is told from the perspective of a young German soldier in World War I. And that is an incredibly, I won't try not to spoil it, but it's an incredibly heartbreaking transition. It's almost like the anti-hero's journey, where this young boy experiences the loss of innocence, and then it all just goes downhill from there. So when I think of the mythologizing and the veneration, almost you could say, of some of these heroes, there's very much a rose-tinted view of them. And in some cases, the rose-tinted view is by design because it's possibly useful. And as well as when I think of the stories of World War I and World War II of young men signing up for war, it's often framed, as you've said, as a big adventure. I'm going to go to war. I'm going to do my part for my country, for my town, for my family, for my mates, kind of thing. And it's this sort of grand adventure. And I do think that in some senses we're lucky, but also cursed by the world that we live in right now, where I can open my newsfeed and I can see exactly what's happening in Gaza right now. I can see videos from the front line in Ukraine and Russia. That's a blessing in the sense that it lets people know what's actually going on. It's also a curse because it's probably something most of us are not equipped to be able to handle emotionally. But when we go to stories in the Bible, particularly when we go to stories that we find inspiring, a lot of them are a lot more conflicted and a lot less shiny, let's say, than we would have liked. It's interesting, there's a companion piece that we included in the November issue of the magazine by Victor Holbert. And this is a European perspective. His article is titled Remembering Those Who Fought Not to Fight. And it details the stories of a couple of different conscientious objectors throughout World War I and II, but particularly World War I. And many people have seen the story of Desmond Doss on the silver screen. Hacksaw Ridge was a huge film a couple of years ago. Probably most people are familiar with the Hacksaw Ridge story, but perhaps not some of the other ones that didn't get their moment in the limelight. So I want to talk about, in the last few moments that we have, some of the conscientious throughout history, but also you touched on some of the biblical heroes that we see in the Bible who are maybe not as heroic as we might think of them. Feel free to jump in at whichever point you'd like to.
Yeah, I think conscientious objectors are heroic. They've been portrayed in my life, even growing up, as heroes. And Desmond Doss's story is phenomenal, the amount of people he saved. But many, especially in World War I, as you mentioned, weren't given the opportunity to serve as medics or to cooperate. Sometimes they're called conscientious cooperators because they're willing to, and I think Desmond was volunteered, he was willing to be in the army to help the war effort, but he didn't want to carry a gun. He didn't want to kill anybody because of his religious conviction. And moreover, he wanted to keep the Sabbath through the war, and so needed special dispensation to get that. And of course, he got the bullying and the, why are you even here? Because you don't want to do anything we tell you, but ended up earning respect through his sheer determination and saving people. In World War I, in Australia, New Zealand, in the UK, in other places, it was a very different story. Because if you didn't want to fight, you were seen as a coward. You were thrown into prison. You were treated horrendously. And many of the conscientious objectors in that conflict chose not to fight. They said they didn't want to fight. It was against their beliefs. And whether or not they were willing to serve as medics, to the gear, whatever was needed, in many ways they didn't get that chance, or some of them felt that any way they would aid the war effort was actually bad because people were dying, and so if you're helping feed the soldiers that are killing everyone, you're part of the problem. And so they weren't sure the ethical line could be drawn. And so those gentlemen, I think, were heroic in a sense because they stood up for what they believed in no matter what came at them. They sacrificed their freedom, they got locked up, they got abused and tortured in some cases, and yet they still stuck at it. And that's one of the real stories that often doesn't get told, or those people don't get remembered. And they paved the way in many ways for those who did serve in World War II as medics and other types of conscientious objectors. Some of the actual religions, like the Seventh-day Adventist Church, got the concessions to have their members not serve or to serve in certain ways because of the people in World War I and conflicts before that had put their line in the sand. This is what I won't do. And they had fought for that. They had suffered and bled for that. And so that's an important thing to remember. The other thing that really helps us in this conversation is to see our heroes as they really are, rather than allowing them to be, for want of a better term, whitewashed, completely sandpapered and smoothed out. And you can still do heroic things, but be a broken person. And I guess that's a really encouraging thought to me. I'll unpack that a little bit. Daniel Reno mentioned that the best way to balance the dangers of mythologizing war and the positives of it, because it does bring people together, it is helpful to remember sacrifices, is to tell the truth. That was his statement. He said, for example, not all the Anzacs were heroic. Some were downright criminal. Others were incompetent. So having that true picture rather than the whitewashed picture saves us from some of the dangers of overreacting or having those myths used as motivation to get us to do bad things. And he goes on to say the Bible does this really well, and this is something I appreciate about the Bible. But there's a lesson about the Bible in this conversation for us, because when you're a kid, you need the Bible age appropriately. And so a lot of the stories in the Bible are sanitized, they're whitewashed, they're toned down, and that means we see the heroic deeds of the heroes of faith, but we don't see some of their failings, some of their shortcomings, some of the brokenness. And what that means is we have a very shallow faith, or we don't grapple with it and understand it as it's meant to be understood. The Bible, unlike any other ancient literature, because in most other ancient literature you find them sort of building up their kings, building up their heroes, saying about all the great things they did. The Bible gives us a true and honest account. So even the most heroic figures, Abraham, Moses, Joseph, they had failings, they had weaknesses. And I think that's a really important thing that the Bible does well. For me, I know what it's like to wrestle with my own nature. I want to do the right thing, like Paul says, but I end up finding myself doing the wrong thing sometimes. And so if the Bible heroes were all perfect, that would be really discouraging to me, because I would be like, they were given some kind of special faith. They had something I didn't have. They were too high, too mighty, too unattainable. I can't reach that sort of faith, so I can get discouraged and give up. But to know that they were broken and that they did terrible things, but they also were struggling and wrestling and striving to do good things at the same time. Now I can relate, because in my life story, I've had some really rough patches and I've had some really good patches. And I can see how I'm not to be worshipped because of those dark patches. Glory goes to God. It points in a different direction than me. It's the same with the Bible. We don't put those heroes in the Bible on a pedestal to be worshipped. Failure and their brokenness points to a God who is forgiving and loving and helped them to do good things through faith in spite of the mess that they made of their own lives and sometimes in their own choices. And so I think when we look at Anzac, when we look at the myths around it, when we look at war and stuff, having a better picture, having a more complete picture of who these people were and what they did and how sometimes they screwed it up, but they were just like us. They were just like us. There are then lessons we can take. There are then things that we can use in our own stories, in our own lives. This side of eternity, we're all going to have very messy, very complicated stories. And I think we can be encouraged by that because we have hope that will get better. And so that gives us a better framework, a better lens to view the world. If we understand that stories are messy and broken, what can we take that's useful out of this to encourage us, to inspire us, to help us without trying to pull the wool over people's eyes and whitewash and use this substitute religion in a sense. We're talking about this memorialization as a substitute for something that we're all yearning for, which is unity, togetherness, a higher purpose than ourselves. That idea of sacrifice and the hero worship that we have, we're really just looking to be part of something bigger and more inspiring than our everyday brokenness leads us to. And so I think there's good things in the commemoration and the memory of events as a population, communally, but I think there's dangers there if we let that get out of whack.
Well, hey, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with our editor, Jared Stackleroth. If you'd like to read his article or the other article that we referenced in the episode, you can do that by heading over to sciencemag.com, and all of those links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, we'd really appreciate you leaving a rating or a review on the podcasting app of your choice. Though if you leave a rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Pocket Casts, we would particularly appreciate that. Now, you may have noticed we've been releasing a lot more episodes than we usually do in quick succession. That's because, quite frankly, there's been a lot happening in our world over the last couple of weeks. We've just had an election in the United States. The Melbourne Cup has come and gone, and we've just been able to celebrate Remembrance Day. And rather than what we usually do, which is to stagger out the episodes on our usual fortnightly release schedule, we decided to just release them all as the events were happening. What that means is we've been able to deliver extra value to you over the last few weeks, but what it also means is we're going to have to take a break over the next couple weeks. So over the next 2 to 3 weeks, we're going to take a break from the podcast, but we're not really going to take a break because in the meantime, we're going to be preparing a special set of episodes to come out in the month of December. So keep an eye out on your podcast feed for when those drop. Apart from that, thank you very much for listening. My name's Jesse, and I'll see you in the next episode.
This is an Adventist Media podcast.